When we imagine the ancient world, we tend to picture philosophers in togas, stern-faced emperors, or dusty mummies lying in eternal silence. What we don't imagine is a Paleolithic caveman casually polishing a stone phallus for a good time. But maybe we should, because in 2005, archaeologists in southwestern Germany unearthed a surprisingly smooth, cylindrical object from the Hohlfels cave, carved from siltstone and dating back to around 28,000 BC. The object measured about 20 centimeters in length and was, well, let's just say nature-inspired. Although some researchers suggested it might have also been used to spark fires or crush berries, others weren't so subtle in their conclusions. Let's quote anthropologist Martin Muller, who called it, quote, the earliest known artificial phallus, and probably a multi-tool. A Swiss Army dildo, if you will. So yes, the history of sex toys doesn't begin in Rome, or Greece, or even Mesopotamia. It begins deep in a Paleolithic cave, with a very committed sculptor and a vision. And if that's what humans were doing before agriculture was even a thing, just imagine what came next. Fast forward a few thousand years to ancient Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization. Cuneiform tablets from the Sumerians, who gave us the wheel, beer, and bureaucracy, also offered surprisingly frank poems about intimacy and fertility rituals. These weren't just love letters. These were erotic prayers. One Akkadian hymn literally praises the goddess Ishtar by describing her quivering thighs and honeyed loins. Another Babylonian tablet advises, if a man's desire is slow to rise, he may take a figure of clay in the shape of a staff and warm it by the fire. So now we've got stone, we've got clay, we've got fire. Humans were experimenting with sensual pleasure before they had organized religion, before they had plumbing, possibly even before they had shame. By the time we get to ancient Egypt, we start seeing objects that are explicitly phallic, not just suggestive. Statuettes of the god Min, known as the god of fertility and reproduction, often depict him with an exaggerated erect penis. Not hidden, not subtle, just there, boldly carved, proudly on display. In some temples, young priests and priestesses were even tasked with fertility rites that involved offerings, chants, and possibly carved objects used in private rituals. Scholars like Dr. Salima Ikram have noted the extremely personal nature of these rites, though nobody really wants to say the quiet part out loud. But we will. Because in the ancient world, sexuality wasn't always hidden in the shadows. It was woven into religion, fertility, and life itself. The line between sacred and sensual, blurred. Deliberately so. And if you think this is where it ends, you haven't met the Greeks yet. In the next part, we're heading to ancient Athens, where lonely housewives had leather toys, playwrights joked openly about dildos, and Dionysus threw parties that made modern bachelor nights look like prayer meetings. Make sure you've got your olives and your sandals ready. Until then, remember, if you think the ancients were innocent, maybe you've just been reading the wrong tablets. The Greeks were never shy about anatomy. Their statues had it all on display: muscles, curves, flutes, and yes, penises. They even had names for different types. The aulisbos was perhaps the most famous, a phallic-shaped device made of leather, wood, or ivory, used by women for sexual pleasure, especially when husbands were away on business, at war, or just plain useless. Aristophanes, the master of vulgar comedy, included a moment in Lysistrata where the women on a sex strike to stop war moan not just about missing their husbands, but their toys. One character cries, "I haven't had a man in 5 days. My aulisbos has dried up." It wasn't just satire. Women really did use these objects. Greek philosopher Oribasius, in his 4th century medical writings, noted that women experiencing uterine suffocation sexual frustration could relieve their symptoms through mechanical stimulation. Translation? Doctor's orders. Get yourself an aulisbos, and they weren't always discreet about it. Some aulisbos were shaped like animals, lions, rams, even dolphins. Others were anatomically ... enthusiastic. Many had internal compartments where olive oil or perfumed balm could be inserted, functioning as both lubricant and fragrance. Because nothing says elegance like scented pleasure. Greek men weren't thrilled about the competition. Playwrights and satirists often mocked women who preferred wood to manhood. The famous comic poet Hipponax referred to women as bored matrons with busy fingers and silent husbands. Charming. Meanwhile, priestesses of Dionysus were engaging in rites that blurred the line between sacred and sensual. Ceremonies involved ecstatic dancing, rhythmic chants, and phallic processions. Massive wooden phalluses were carried through city streets as part of religious festivals, meant to honor fertility, intoxication, and the chaos of pleasure. The cult of Dionysus attracted women from all walks of life, wives, widows, even aristocrats seeking temporary release from rigid societal roles. Some scholars argue these festivals included symbolic penetration rituals, reenactments of divine unions, and the use of Olympos-like objects in trance-like states. Whether literal or symbolic, the message was clear: pleasure could be holy. But Greek sexuality wasn't all joyful. Some philosophers, like Plato, warned that excess indulgence weakened the soul. The Stoics believed pleasure should never be pursued for its own sake. And yet, they still built shrines shaped like genitals. Go figure. One popular artifact from the island of Delos shows a group of women offering fruit, wine, and carved phalluses at a fertility altar. The offering bowls are delicately carved. The phalluses? Not so much. When you walked past a Greek pottery stall, you might see a water jug, a vase with painted warriors, and next to it, a cheerful Olympos carved from ivory, maybe even gift-wrapped in a silk pouch. Because why not? If the Greeks embraced sensuality with elegance, the Romans took it and made it weird. In Rome, sex wasn't just an act. It was law, propaganda, magic, and sometimes even home decor. Just ask the phallus fascinus, a little dangling penis amulet that hung from baby cribs, soldiers' helmets, and even shop doors. Yes, a penis to protect your house. Or your baby. These weren't jokes. Romans believed the erect phallus had apotropaic powers, the ability to ward off evil spirits, bad luck, and nosy neighbors. You could buy them carved in wood, cast in bronze, even encrusted with tiny gemstones. Because nothing says luxury like a ruby-studded penis on a necklace. They even installed massive versions above doorways. Picture this. You're strolling through Pompeii, admiring mosaics and columns, when suddenly, bam! There's a stone phallus pointing straight at you from a bakery archway. And if you follow the direction it's pointing, you might just end up at the nearest brothel. Not subtle, not ashamed, very efficient. But when it came to actual sex toys, especially those used by women, Romans got twitchy. Satirists like Juvenal and Martial were practically shaking with outrage. One poem by Juvenal accuses upper-class women of using dildos made from exotic ivory and mocks their husbands for being replaced by elephants. Martial, ever the gentleman, wrote, "She lies alone with her Sabine Olympos, ignoring her husband's limp poetry and limp everything else." Ouch. Some Roman doctors weren't any more forgiving. Soranus of Ephesus, a gynecologist of the 2nd century, warned that frequent self-pleasure weakened the uterus and invited melancholy. Sure, Soranus. That's definitely how biology works. Meanwhile, Roman craftsmen were innovating. Excavations in Herculaneum and Ostia have turned up wooden phallic objects, some with leather harness attachments. Others were hollow, possibly to be filled with oils or herbs. One even had faint traces of red dye, maybe a touch of flair. Of course, these weren't labeled sex toys. No one chiseled for adult fun into marble. But context, placement, and poetic rage tell us everything we need to know. Women weren't supposed to be too interested in pleasure. They could birth, obey, and maybe light a lamp, but if they reached for a carved tool, suddenly they were sorceresses, seductresses, or worse, independent. And that terrified Roman men. One court record from 1st century BCE mentions a widow being exiled for possessing items unsuitable for a woman of mourning. The inventory listed a silver Olympos, a leather girdle, and several scrolls of foreign poems. Scandalous. Roman society wanted control over everything: land, gods, wives. And what wives did when no one was looking. The irony? The same men who banned dildos from temples still hung penis wind chimes in their gardens. Roman logic, complicated. For a culture that carved penises into drinking cups, the ancient world had surprisingly little to say about women who loved other women. Male-male relationships? Greek literature practically drools over them, but women? Quiet. Deliberately so. And yet, the silence doesn't mean it didn't happen. Take the Greek term tribas, used to describe a woman who acts like a man in bed. Not exactly subtle. The term appears in Roman texts as tribade and is almost always written with a smirk or a sneer. Doctors like Galen, while cataloging the many horrifying things women's bodies were supposedly prone to, couldn't help but mention tribades who took pleasure unnaturally, sometimes using devices fashioned of leather or ivory. One Roman satirist wrote about a woman who wears a belt not for her waist, but for conquest. Another described a certain Vestal virgin who was caught with a sacred phallus, not issued by the temple. Official records? Almost none. Gossip? Plenty. In 79 CE, just before Vesuvius erupted, a graffiti found in Pompeii reads, "Valeria loves Julia more than any man ever could." No follow-up, no context. Just love scratched into a wall, fossilized by ash. Medical manuals, however, couldn't help themselves. Serranus, yes, him again, warned that too much clitoral friction might enlarge the organ, causing women to lose their modesty. In other words, if your pleasure makes you visible, you're dangerous. Later Roman texts go further. A now lost but quoted segment of Physiologus Latina tells of women in Alexandria who wore devices strapped to their thighs and challenged men in both action and appetite. Naturally, this is followed by instructions for corrective fasting, because nothing cures gayness like skipping lunch. Some sources even accuse women of witchcraft when caught with such objects. In 2nd century Antioch, a widow named Nangisa was brought before a local magistrate for employing enchantments to control the desires of women. The items seized from her home were listed as mirrors, salves, and an artificial member made of wax. Witchcraft? Maybe. Or maybe she just knew what she liked. What makes these stories remarkable is not how scandalous they are, but how familiar they feel: private love, intimate creativity, outsiders turning whispers into accusations. Ancient women weren't just passive players in marble statues. They explored, experimented, and when no one was looking made tools that fit their own hands. Sometimes literally, they were lovers, makers, and rule breakers, and they were everywhere. We just forgot how to read the signs. Not every sex toy in antiquity looked like one. Some were sandals, some were idols, some were suspiciously creative fruit bowls. Take the Roman solea leather sandals worn indoors, often by women. In literature, they're mentioned innocently. But a strange passage in Satyricon, the scandalous novel by Petronius, describes a noblewoman requesting a carved sole made stiff by heat and scented oils to soothe her restlessness. Sandal? Maybe. Strap-on disguised as fashion accessory? Sandal? Maybe. Strap-on disguised as fashion accessory? Possibly. Subtle? Not even a little. Then there's the infamous pleasure statues of Alexandria. Though none survive intact, several Greco-Roman medical texts describe idols of Aphrodite and Pan that included removable parts meant to be worshipped in privacy. One physician warns that idolatry of this kind may lead the devotee to frenzy, exhaustion, and unclean hands. You can almost hear the churchmen panicking through the parchment. Even everyday objects weren't safe. A wine jug from Cyprus dated to the 3rd century BCE was shaped like a satyr with its handle doubling as a rather obvious anatomical exaggeration. Archaeologists first labeled it ceremonial, then symbolic. Eventually someone just sighed and wrote, "Unknown use." But perhaps the most creative award goes to the sandal lover from the 10th century Encyclopedia of Pleasure, written by Ali ibn Nasr al-Chattab. Those centuries after classical antiquity, he drew heavily from Greek and Roman sources. One passage reads, "If a woman is slow to stir, her lover may carve from sandalwood a replica of the male member, warm it by the fire, and let it precede him in the act." Erotica wasn't hidden. It was embedded in walls, baked into pottery, etched onto utensils. It rang from amulets, spilled from mosaics, and sometimes hung from necks as protective charms. Roman poet Catullus once complained that his lover preferred the cold stone over his warm flesh. He probably meant a statue. Or not, maybe she just liked what didn't talk back. Today, those objects rest behind museum glass, labeled ritual item, religious figurine, or simply unknown function. We know what they were. We've always known.